Anyway, Stacy, as we're talking about this in Luke chapter 6, we last time went through the end of Luke 5, verses 33 to 39, and we were looking at this, I think we called it a thought bridge or a connector from what Jesus had been doing in those three healings. Going into what he's doing now, we're going to be looking at some actions that Jesus takes on the Sabbath day and gets the leaders of the time kind of fired up. But in the middle of that, looking at last week, he kind of brought out this idea of new wine and old wineskins and how the old framework doesn't fit for what God's really actually doing. And the Pharisees kind of missed the point then. It seems like they're kind of missing the point today, too.
They seem very good at missing the point.
They're a lot like us, I think.
But they're more focused on, like we were talking about earlier, off the air, the letter of the law. This is what you're supposed to do.
Right.
So they're freaking out when they see him, and they're almost trying to catch him doing things that aren't, exactly how what it says.
Yeah, it seems like that when they start out in the first couple of verses of chapter 6, when Luke writes, "One Sabbath Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels," which was perfectly legal. It wasn't like they were stealing. That wasn't the issue that was provided for in the law. But they saw them rubbing their hands together and eating the kernels. So some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Because that rubbing their hands together to get the kernels of grain out of the heads, that was somehow laborious and enough to justify a Sabbath breaking. And I almost feel like Jesus is, like kind of snickering at him. I don't know if you guys can see Stacy through the podcast as you're listening.
I do say see you later.
But there is a grin going on throughout this. And I wonder if Jesus didn't kind of have that same kind of feeling as he's answering him and says, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry?" And so he expands it. He goes past the Sabbath now.
Right.
Goes back to the Old Testament story. And David and his companions are hungry, and they went into the house of God and took the consecrated bread, the showbread, and that was only legal for the priest to eat, not for anybody else. But they went in, David took it, ate it, and not only David, who was the king, maybe you write that off because he's the king, but he also gave some to his companions. So Jesus said to them at the time, as if to say, don't be confused.
Right.
The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Elsewhere he says the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That's the point, is this isn't about the rule keeping. God provides the Sabbath for us to instruct us, to recharge us, to refocus us on him. And if we get focused on all the little rules and miss out on the point that this is about acknowledging God and owning our dependence on him, then why are we keeping the Sabbath anyway? Because we're not really honoring him with it.
Right. So it's not so much, the rules are there for a reason.
For sure. The rules matter.
But it's more about just keeping up appearances and following all those rules to a T. If you don't feel that and you don't acknowledge it in your heart and you're not really, it's like you're talking about earlier with a kid going to, or someone in high school who doesn't go to these rager parties and doesn't drink and doesn't do whatever, but they have rebellion in their heart and feel the same things. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what, to me, even this stupid grain thing, like I'd be walking through if you're walking through a field and you pick something and you eat it, that's not work.
Right, yeah.
For anybody. And so it seems like more work to me, and like you said earlier, who would notice that?
Right.
If you're walking through,
not looking for
right.
it, you're
So
looking
it seems,
for something.
To me, like the Pharisees are doing more work by trying to keep an eye out
Yeah,
for what these guys are doing wrong.
Yeah, they're putting a lot of effort into this.
Right.
And that's the concern.
So
is you're
check
putting
yourself.
out effort, exerting yourself on the Sabbath. It's a whole lot less stress for us to do what we're doing than it is for you to be, sneaking around
It's
trying to catch us.
almost comical, and I'm sure it is for Jesus.
That's why I say I wonder if he was kind of snickering as he says this, because he gets it. That's the thing. Jesus is the most profoundly mature individual ever. He sees the whole picture. He's got the whole perspective. And so the stability and all the hallmarks of maturity are manifest in Jesus in a way that nobody else ever could. And for him to see these, tattletales out here running around. Oh, I saw what you did. I saw what you did. It had to almost be comical to them if it weren't so horribly tragic. And so, for them to be doing that, they're worried about whether these people are breaking the Sabbath law with their hands and rubbing the grain together, or rubbing the heads together. But the whole time they're already breaking the Sabbath law in their hearts. Their intent is to do harm. Their intent is malicious. They don't have any, any thought toward, hey, you know what? Let's just relax and enjoy God. Let's focus on the good things of the kingdom. And boy, I sound kind of like a hippie as I'm saying this kind of stuff. Let's just all get along and be happy. But but their intent is 100% to stop these guys, to go after them and to find something wrong. From doing nothing. So you're looking for something to get wrong. And because we do love the pop culture references in here, if anybody has ever seen Phineas and Ferb, it's kind of like their sister Candace trying to bust them all the time. They're not doing anything. They're doing their wild adventures and building space stations in the backyard or whatever. And Candace is always trying to bust them. And it never works out because she's out of control looking for a way to go and get them. The Pharisees are a little like that. So the Pharisees are like Candace, and Jesus' disciples are like Phineas and Ferb, one of the great cartoons ever.
You know what? I've never seen Phineas.
Oh my goodness gracious!
It was like in between my age.
Yeah, you're gonna have to get
there.
educated on
I know.
this. This is good stuff.
But and it's just kind of annoying. I mean, I feel like I'm at a loss for words because it's kind of annoying to me how. But at the same time, I feel we still do that today.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, not with Jesus, obviously, but with other quote-unquote Christians.
We do, for sure. And with non-Christians. I mean, we are regularly comparing other people.
We're looking for them to slip up.
And even when we think we're looking for positive things, very often we're looking for negative. As long as you match up with me, I'm looking for somebody that looks like me, that acts like me, that thinks like me, that does those kinds of things. And I've expressed to you and to others, probably not on this podcast, but I get very fed up sometimes with people that hold to my doctrinal beliefs and want to go banging the drum of how everybody else is a heretic.
Right.
I'm like, wait a minute, now we're just becoming like Pharisees. And coming from a background that focuses heavily on God's sovereignty, I can identify very well with some of the fantastic teachings coming out from the new young reformers, the young bearded fellows who like to talk about theology, and that's great. A lot of times they're doing that while they're doing a lot of that while they're drinking beer, and that's not really my scene. But as they're going about this, we want to spend a lot of time talking about the great doctrines that we have, and then bashing Joel Osteen as some terrible heretic because he might say something we would disagree with. And there are times that you hear some of those things like, yeah, that maybe that's wrong. Maybe we need to get that right. And I'm not saying this as a criticism of Osteen because I don't really listen to his stuff a lot or read a ton of his stuff. But are there things that I would disagree with him on? I'm sure there are. There are things I disagree with a lot of people on.
You're never going to agree with somebody 100%.
But the point of it is when we start looking for those things, then we go crazy. We go on these witch hunts trying to find what everybody's doing wrong. The Pharisees are doing that here.
Do you think it's because they're scared?
Oh, maybe. I think James McDonald would say that's at the root of everything. Somewhere underneath all of our sin is a fear and a hurt.
Well, because I feel like we do that with other people to make ourselves feel better. To make ourselves feel a little bit higher.
Yeah, I remember hearing that from youth pastors when I was in junior high. You put down people to make yourself bigger.
Oh yeah.
And I don't doubt that.
But
I don't doubt that that's true to a certain extent. I think a big part of it is what Jesus said at the end of Luke 5, that we get used to a particular vintage of wine, then something new comes along and we can't handle it. No, I'm not going to address that. I'm not going to embrace that. I'm not going to go with that. We get our old wineskins, these rigid pictures of what it should look like. And for a long time, evangelicalism believed that the utopian picture of the church is 1958. If we all, had poodle skirts and lived in this way and sang these hymns, then everybody would be better and America was great. And now, if we can just get to look like that, we can make America great again. But that's not ever been the reality. There have been flaws always, and
Look at Greece.
and we need to be in a place where what matters to us is what God is really doing, not the framework or the preconceived ideas that we have. But let's get in, look at the Word, and embrace it. Now, if the Pharisees and the teachers of the law had been able to set aside their pride long enough to listen to what Jesus had said and say, you know what, we got some things to learn. Maybe he's right. Maybe we missed the boat on this. And in John chapter 3, we see that with Nicodemus, who is a Pharisee. He's one of these guys. He's been keeping all these detailed laws that were added later on after the Old Testament in the intertestamental period, and the rabbis brought in all these additional teachings, and the Pharisees are adding layer upon layer to revive Israel and to bring people to a state of holiness. But it just became ritualistic legalism.
Right.
So in John 3, he's speaking to Nicodemus, this Pharisee, who meets with him at night, interestingly, probably afraid of what anybody else might think. But he's wrestling with it. Mm-hmm. And he must eventually get it. But he's at least having the conversation. Jesus talks to him then about being born again. Forget about all this other stuff. None of this matters. You got all that. Jesus doesn't even spend time on it. He just says, you got to be born again. God loved the world so much that he gave his one and only Son. And if you will believe, then you'll be saved. You don't have to perish. And Nicodemus struggled with it, but he kept the conversation going. So then Jesus is able to clarify for him.
And it's not that we're not supposed to struggle with it.
No, that's right. And in fact, the name Israel means wrestled with God. So he blessed Jacob, who was a deceiver, when he wrestled with God. He wants us to wrestle with him. And Nicodemus shows up at the end of Jesus' life, earthly, physical life, with Joseph of Arimathea. You got a rich man and a Pharisee taking the body of Jesus. That's interesting. So clearly now he's not worried about what anybody thinks. Somewhere along the way, he got it. Mm-hmm. These guys don't, and maybe some of them will at some point, but in all likelihood, everybody that's included here stays included here. And the new wine that Jesus is pouring out is just going to shatter their old wine bottles. It's going to destroy all of that. And they think that they're going to put an end to it. Not so much, because that's why we're still here today. And the power of being able to see the reality, which is, I think, one of the big keys to spiritual maturity, and why it's such a picture of what Jesus does. The power of being able to see the reality is it gives life and breath and meaning to all of the ritual. And then the ritual becomes something. Without that, all the ritual in the world just becomes an idol. I was at a funeral recently where we were going through a particular liturgy, and I just felt, and this isn't for everybody for sure, but I just could feel from a number of the people, including the officiant of the funeral, as if you're going through the motions.
Right.
You're reading the words, you're making the gestures, you're doing all the things, but the heart's not engaged.
That was one thing I had struggled with. I went to a Catholic college, and I was in the choir, so we went to a lot of masses, and every single mass is exactly the same, and it was almost numbing to me, just the call and response. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, and that's good for some people, and I don't obviously know anybody's heart, but it was you'd look at people and they would just be blank.
Yeah, if you lose the heart,
right,
then all the ritual becomes meaningless.
Right.
I was at I coached at a Lutheran school for a number of years, and as I was interacting with them, I became exposed to it was a Wisconsin Synod church school, and as I was exposed to them, I got to see more liturgical things than I was personally used to, and I was astonished at the passion that some of them had. The principal of the school and the guidance counselor, just a passionate heart for revival. One of our local pastors at a Missouri Synod church, and for anybody who doesn't know this, this podcast is part of Real Life Community Church, which is a non-denominational church, and not from a liturgical mainline type of background at all. But we have a local church here with a Missouri Synod Lutheran church, and the pastor there just has such a passion for the gospel, and so it gives life to all of the same rituals. Mm-hmm. But if you have the ritual and you don't have that engagement with the Spirit of God, then the emptiness of it is very much what Jesus is talking about.
Right, the ritual itself isn't necessarily bad.
Right, that's exactly right. So the Sabbath isn't bad here. The keeping of the law, I think before we got on air, I don't think we were on air as if on the radio. Really? Before we started recording, we were talking about Matthew 5:18. I don't think we talked about it in the podcast, but when Jesus talked about the fact that not one part of the law is going to pass away until everything is fulfilled and accomplished. Jesus isn't saying the law is bad. The Apostle Paul doesn't say the law is bad. So the law had its purpose, and its purpose was to point us to Christ, to move us to this place where we could receive the gospel. But the gospel's always been the point. Right. It's always been God doing what God was doing to redeem his people, not his people working to try to get to God. And the Pharisees have lost sight of that. Jesus is restoring that, both in this grain scenario and right after that as he heals a man on the Sabbath, and they condemn him for that. Maybe condemn is a strong word here. They criticize him for that.
I think about what they're going to do to him.
Eventually, they'll condemn him, right? And so here they're saying, "Well, this is unlawful. It's terrible." So they're trying to confront him here with the grain thing. They get showed up. Then in the second scenario, they're talking amongst themselves, because I guess you don't want to confront Jesus. It doesn't go well. But he knows what they're saying, so he says, really, what's going on? Which one of these is more lawful, to do good and to heal, or to do evil and to do harm, to save life or destroy it? And so he looks around at them. So, I'm feeling this. One translation says he looked at them one by one. I don't know that that's a very literal translation, but as he looks around at each of them in the room, it's as if he's making eye contact with them, saying, I want you to see this. I want you to watch this happen. And he heals the man by simply just saying, stretch out your hand. Right. He doesn't do any work.
No, doesn't even touch him.
Right. So he doesn't do anything that's a violation of the Sabbath.
Right.
They want to accuse him of that.
Right.
He doesn't do anything that breaks the law.
He speaks.
He just speaks because he's Jesus. In another recording, in another gospel, it talks about, well, what if you had an animal that would fall into the well? You're going to let it just sit there and die? No, of course you're not. You're going to get out of the well, because that's what you do. And it would be wrong. It would be dishonoring God to use the Sabbath as an excuse to let your animal die in the well. That's foolishness. He says the same thing to them in another place about, you're tithing on your spices. You're so meticulous about the law, and yet you're cheating your parents. That's not right. You've totally just disregarded everything about the spirit of the law while you focus on the tiniest letter, and you've missed it. Completely missed the point. You have all of the ritual and none of the reality. You've got the form, you don't have the function. And so they need to get to a place where, instead of just seeing, and this I think is what Jesus is doing in them and in us, is getting to a place where it's not just, here's what we've been told, and from this rote action, we're just going to go through and check all the boxes.
Right.
We need to have a perpetual prioritizing of our purposes as we're going through this, to look at not being performance oriented, not getting stuck in just the doing, but why? Why are we doing this? And as a parent, I guess I get this maybe better than I did when I was younger. I want my children to obey me, and they're going to obey me. By hook or by crook, it's going to happen because Dad wins. And so when I say take out the trash, you're going to take out the trash.
I picked up your daughter today, and I said, what have you been doing today? And she goes, my dad left me a list of chores, so I did all those. I said, well, good. I'm glad you did it.
There you go. And I want them to obey, and it's my responsibility to cause them to obey in whatever means necessary. However, what I really want is for them to obey from their heart, because they want to, because our relationship motivates that. Now, that takes growth and time, and we have to use discipline to get to that place. But God doesn't want me to obey him grudgingly, to have this obligation. Well, it's Sunday, I guess we have to go to church.
Right. That's the opposite of what.
Exactly the opposite. And that's what Jesus is saying here about the Sabbath. What? Really? You think the Sabbath is something to worship? We're not here to worship the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a tool to worship the Lord.
Right.
I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. I'm telling you.
Worship the
I
Lord, not the
created
law.
it. That's right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, then we'll end there. That was a good point because I hardly ever make those. So we'll stop there before I say something else. Thank you guys for joining us today, and we'll catch you later.